Comedy Central's World News headquarters in New York, this is The Daily Show with Jon Stewart.
Hello, welcome to The Daily Show. We got a great show lined up for you today, but first let me fill you in a little bit. As you may or may not have noticed, I'm not actually Jon Stewart. I'm actually the intern from the third floor. But we just found out about 15 minutes ago that Comedy Central is giving us some pretty drastic budget cuts. So Jon Stewart and about half our staff just walked out of the door. Instead of what we were going to originally do that we now can't afford, we're going to do the equally exciting story covering the retrospect of the Minimum Wage Restoration Act of 1989. We have some great interviews lined up with two of the people who were actually very important in that whole process, one of whom we may or may not have had to resurrect from the dead 10 minutes ago using a human sacrifice in the basement. But let me give you a little bit of background to the whole act before we get into it. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which gave workers in America many rights and things that they probably should have had to start with, like a minimum wage. But this was the act that really finalized it. And so since then, the act has been updated through incremental amendments, which has raised the minimum wage until 1981, where due to a certain president, it halted at $3.35. For more information about the whole act, we have our special correspondent, Hannah Banana, in the building.
Thank you, intern. By the 100th Congress, Reagan had lost his Republican majority in both houses. With a new Democratic majority, top Democratic leaders like Senator Ted Kennedy and Representative Augustus Hocking attempted to resurrect the fight for minimum wage legislation. Kennedy believed it was unacceptable that the present minimum wage does not permit full-time workers to provide the bare necessities for their families. I spoke to Hawkins, one of the creators of the Minimum Wage Restoration Act of 1988. Representative Hawkins, what makes you feel so strongly about this bill?
It's an insult to the working men and women of this great nation that have to suffer increasing prices in food and gas without an increase in minimum wage to match. We're trying to restore purchasing power and to lower socioeconomic sectors of society to counter the inflationary effects of Reaganomics.
Now that version of the legislation was blocked by a Republican filibuster in the Senate. But the Democrats were not ready to go down without a fight. At the beginning of the new 101st Congress in 1989, Representative Hawkins reintroduced a measure that would increase the Minimum Wage Act. This act was called House Resolution 2.
Our goal was to raise minimum wage to $4.55 over the course of 2 years. After all, one of Bush's campaign promises was to support our new legislation that would increase the minimum wage, legislation that Reagan failed to consider.
And I would never go back on my campaign promises to the American people.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
So it seemed like everyone was finally ready to work together to enact some changes. Oh wait, no they weren't.
President Bush has said he will veto anything over $4.25 an hour.
If we raise that minimum wage too much, then we make it more difficult to get jobs.
So the debate over how much to pay boils down to 30 cents.
30 cents?
My difference with the Congress is not just about 30 cents an hour. It's about hundreds of thousands of jobs that would be preserved by my administration's approach, as opposed to those who would be sacrificed under the excessive increases included in this legislation. I've offered to compromise and foster bipartisanship, but increasing the minimum wage like this would stifle the creation of jobs and hurt poor people's chances of getting jobs.
But if congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle were willing to work together and get on board with this policy, wouldn't they have been able to override Bush's veto? To explain this, we go to our pivotal politics guru.
For our pivotal politics model, we've aligned all of our senators from left to right, from very liberal to very conservative, on a spectrum of -1 to 1. Now the key part of this that the Senate Democrats were worried about begins with Senator Joe Lieberman, who was our filibuster pivot. He's the vote that was required to invoke cloture in the case of filibuster in the Senate, and our median voter, Senator Alan Dixon, as well as our veto pivot, which is the most crucial in this case, and that is Senator Nancy Kassebaum from Kansas. And now to take a closer look at the pivotal politics model, What the Democrats needed in order to get this bill passed and to secure the veto pivot was all of the senators from furthest left at -1 all the way to Senator number 67. But in this version of the bill, they were unable to secure that vote, and actually unable to secure the vote before it either. Number 66 also was not attained. And as a side note, 2 Senate Democrats also did not pass on, leaving the total vote for this bill at 63.
This country has pressing job problems, but raising the minimum wage is no solution. I may be a moderate to liberal Republican, but I'm still a Republican.
Both chambers passed the legislation, but President Bush vetoed it. This bill was more about partisan politics and pleasing the party than it was about pleasing the constituents. Senator Kassebaum was not in a re-election year, so that afforded her the political capital to move this legislation further to the right and align it more with the Republican Party's ideology. If the Democrats had been able to secure Kassebaum's vote, they would have secured the veto pivot that would have protected against any veto attempt by President Bush. However, Senator Kassebaum did not vote for the legislation, leaving the Democrats without the sufficient majority to override a presidential veto. Back to you, intern.
Oh, right. Now, Michelle, you just finish it off.
So the Democrats had to go back to the drawing board and make some concessions to appeal to Kassebaum. A week later, the Democrats proposed amendments that included an incremental increase over the next 2 years to $4.25 instead of the $4.55 they had initially proposed. A clause securing a lower wage for youth during job training was also added. These concessions were enough to win over not only Kassebaum, but also 29 House Republicans who had previously voted against the measure. The final bill was signed into law in November 1989.